Hello chess friends, this is FIDE Master Valeryov, and in our lecture today I want to continue our discussion on the attacking chess and exactly what kind of tips and principles you should use when attacking the opponent. Well, today I want to point my attention mostly on the attack against a castled king, for difference than my first lecture when I was explaining how to attack an opponent's king that is caught in the center. So I believe that this theme is very important because it is the most common to see a castled king in over-the-board chess, and in most games both players will actually castle. So it's a good idea to know some common tactics that arise in such positions, as well as relevant ideas associated with them. When attacking a king that is castled, it is worth looking out for the following themes. Number one, you should eventually target any weaknesses in the enemy's camp that you can point, like pawns or anything like that, like maybe weak squares also. This could be, as I mentioned, pawn around the opponent's king, which has moved one square forward. Pawn moves, you should know that, always create weaknesses. So, for example, if we imagine that in this position black moves his pawn to g6, we will see that the g6 will create some weaknesses around the black king. The squares on f6, g7, and h6 will be especially weak in this case. White might begin thinking how to place a piece on f6 or maybe h6, which would not be possible if black pawn remains still on g7. So the long a1, h8 diagonal could be exploited, and to white's advantage, of course. So this is about if black goes with something like g7 to g6, and for example, if he does some move like h7 to h6, this will create some direct targets for white. White might be able to sacrifice on h6 at some point, opening up the black king, and also the g6 square will also be somehow weakened. That's why basically there is a very important principle which says when you notice that the king can be attacked, always try to avoid to push your pawns from that king's position. And right here, if black plays either g6 or h6, eventually his king will get very weakened, and white can take some advantage of that by employing some of those combinations. Obviously, what I told you about just a second ago always depends upon the setup of pieces. In many cases, a player can target such weaknesses by maneuvering his pieces towards his opponent's weak areas. That's why one of the most important points when attacking is to bring as many pieces as we can on the same area where we attack. So that's actually the first point. Any weaknesses in the enemy's camp should be targeted. The second point is also a very important one, and as well as considering where your own pieces are placed, it is also important to consider where your opponent's pieces are. Remember that an attack will have a greater chance of success when your opponent's pieces are either undeveloped or stuck in the other side of the board. So basically, when we notice such a thing, then we can see what kind of direct threats or maybe combinations we can find. For example, when the opponent has his pieces on the other flank of the board. So that's why we should always think about where the opponent's pieces are and how can you eventually use the majority of your pieces that you will exploit to make your own threats against the opponent's king. That's the second thing. And the third thing that you should actually know is that always before to attack, you should familiarize yourself with the most common sacrifices which can occur in the definite position against the opponent's king. For example, there are even appropriate terms that you can know against sacrifices and combinations against the opponent's king. For instance, actually in this position which is now on the board, we have one of the most interesting, I would say, positions, because it can be supplied a kind of attack against Black's king with a very typical sacrifice, with a very typical combination. That's what I told you about these typical combinations that basically should be learned. So right here, this is an example from the game Lugovoy against Kallio, played in Gaussdau in 2003, and after his good move, actually, castles, Black decided that there will be no problems at all. So next move he's gonna play bishop d7, bishop c6, or maybe even rook e8. And if White decides to castle, then Black can even go with something like h6. So there will be no particular problems. However, now White is on a move, and he chose the most appropriate moment to employ really dangerous threats against Black's king. So here it comes the move e5. As you can see, this move directly attacks the f6 knight, and when Black actually takes that knight away, the most logical move seems to be knight to d5, just to put it in the center. So in this position, actually, White has a very beautiful combination that is very typical for this kind of positions when Black doesn't really have any pieces to support the king's side. For example, now we see the e5 pawn that has taken the f6 square. So we have seen this already in a lot of positions. And actually, when Black's king is unsupported, then White can make a very beautiful combination connected with the move bishop takes h7 check. In fact, this combination has actually a whole name. So this is named the Greek gift, as the standard Greek gift combination, and this term also crops up frequently and leads to a one position here and in similar positions when Black cannot really include his knight to protect the h7 through f6. So in fact, after bishop takes h7, Black has two options. One is to accept the sacrifice and take king takes h7. The other is to really go back and avoid it. Well, if we look at the king h8 variation that avoids the sacrifice, we see that White can go with even with moves like knight to g5, or even to go with knight e4, and practically that king will be in a very bad position over there. Like after that, knight g5, then queen h5 is coming, and Black's king on h8 will sooner or later get checkmated, or Black will lose a lot of material. So that's a bad idea, and the only chance for Black remains to accept that sacrifice, to take king takes h7. So what about this variation? Well, king takes h7 at this point is met by a very strong move for White, and this is knight to g5 check. So by getting the Black's king into this check, White also opens up the diagonal of the queen to h5, and also he is able to put some direct mating threats. For instance, now if Black plays king g8, that seems to be the most logical to bring the king on a safe place, then there is the queen to h5 coming, threatening a checkmate to h7, and after rook e8, the only way to free the square for the king to go on f8. Then there is queen takes f7 check, king to h8, and then there is simply coming back of the queen to h5, and then after king g8, queen h7 check, king f8, queen h8. That short but very strong combination practically leads to a checkmate. Black's king has nowhere to go. Now we saw a particularly instructive case when White is practically destroying Black's pawn bastions on the king's side with just few moves, and then basically he continues with attack of his strong pieces like the queen, and he's checkmating Black. So of course Black can go other way, like choose not to go back on g8 because of queen h5, but he might want to go forward. But actually this is also not such a good option. If he goes king h6, then there is knight takes f7, double discover check, and Black's queen on d8 fails next move. And if he plays king g6, which actually happened in the game, After king g6, white can play the very simple but lethal actually queen c2 check. So now black's king is checked. If black goes with king h5 then or king h6, then there is queen h7 check coming, and next move, since the knight on g5 is supported by the bishop, there is the very nice and beautiful checkmate with the pawn from h3. And but basically the only chance after queen c2 seems to be to play the f7 pawn f5. So what about this variation right here? Well, I don't think that white can really checkmate black's king, but it's not only his hope. His main idea was to force him to go forward and at least to gain some big material advantages. After f5, white can take en passant. Now black's king is under the check, and after king takes f6, white followed this up with knight e4 check. Again, black's king is in trouble, and now since black is forced to go back with the king, white is following it up with queen takes c5 check. Already he took back the bishop sacrifice that he gave with bishop takes h7. He has a pawn more and additionally a decisive attack against black's king. So black played a couple of more moves, and of course after white got his king on a safe place, he just moved his bishop and coordinated his rooks, after which he activated them on the central files. He won very quickly. So the point of this position, the whole combination of white, and why it is possible, is one of the major ideas when we want to employ attack against a castled king of the opponent. Remember that attack against the castled king of the opponent is only and always possible if the opponent doesn't really have any more pieces supporting his kingside position. So if he's left without supportive manor pieces on the kingside castle, and also if he doesn't really have any solid rock pawn bastions to protect them, then we can even consider sacrifices with pieces in order to really destroy these pawn bastions and then continue with some additional threats against the king. So that's the so-called Greek gift combination with bishop takes h7 that is particularly instructive to show us how we can employ attack against an opponent's castled king when it has no sufficient protection. But now let me show you a very instructive example that was played from one of the great Russian chess players, Mikhail Chigorin. So he employed attack against a supported castled king, and it was a really beautiful and magnificent example. So this example happened in a early game actually of Mikhail Chigorin when he was a very young chess master, but it's particularly instructive to see how in a clear way he exploited the opportunity to attack an opponent's castled king still in the beginning. So the variation that we are going to play is actually in the gioco piano. After e4, e5, knight f3, black plays knight to c6, and white played bishop to c4. So black plays bishop to c5, and in this position white plays d3. So the point of the variation with d3 is to stabilize the central pawn on e4, and eventually white wants to get a very quiet and easy to employ development. Now he wants to castle on the short side, wants to play knight c3, bishop g5, then make coordination between the rooks, and easy development without any particular problems. However, that's not so easy, and let me show you why. After d3, in this game black played knight f6, and of course, seeing the immediate opportunity to pin the knight, white didn't really want to refuse it, so he played bishop to g5. Now black played h6, kind of useful move, threatening the bishop and eventually preparing a free square for the king for eventual castling. White played bishop to h4, of course, to take the bishop, not exchanging, and black played d6 in this position. So here white made a mistake by choosing to castle on the king side and Mainly that was a mistake because he underestimated the opportunities for black to start even a immediate attack, considering that the position is closed, and that he doesn't really have the castle. So black is not castled at this point, and that's really something very important. So at this point, 7 move castles for white is premature and incorrect. There is a danger of black's replying like g5 and following up with a pawn at storm attack against white's castle position. So remember that in a very how to say, large occasions of when white castles on the king side and black doesn't have the castle in Gioco Piano, black is getting very strong activities over there with his pawns and his pieces. So after castles, black played the immediate g5. Once again, one of the most important ideas behind black's success with g5 and h5 is that the position is closed. So if the position was opened, as we learned the previous time, black's king in the center can be attacked very easily by white's pieces. So now we have the pawns on e5 and d6 that are protecting the king. White doesn't have open files to attack, and he doesn't have even a good way to try to open those files, since d4 is now controlled by 3 pieces. And for c3, white will need some additional preparation that won't really happen so easy. So after g5, black is starting the immediate threats. White took his bishop back to a g3, and black played a very strong move that on a first sight it seems like it's completely suicidal. So black played h5 in this position, sacrificing the g5 pawn, but as we can see, h5 has the clear idea because black wants to play h4 next move and trap white's bishop. However, it doesn't seem to be very clear why is black giving to white an opportunity to take on g5 and in the same time to threat on f7. However, there is a particular reason, and I will show it to you now. After knight takes g5, black played the simple and a very confidential h4. And now, in fact, black doesn't worry about the consequences of knight takes f7 and what kind of material he will lose, but in fact, h4 is not pointed only against white's dark square bishop on g3, but what black wants is to continue his attack consistently. In fact, he gives up his queen, as you will see, for the bishop on g3. Of course, this wouldn't be a good exchange if white had not castled, but against the castled position, the attack is actually decisive. So, of course, white decided that knight takes f7 will be more effective, of course, if he takes with the bishop, as we can easily see. Bishop takes f7 and king f8 would not really create any problems to black, so next move he would take the bishop and white will end up with a bishop down. So knight takes f7, and what about this move? Now that the queen is hanging as well as the rook on h8, so it seems that white should be winning here. Well, after knight takes f7, Chigorin shocked his opponent with the move h takes g3. Now this move actually sacrifices the queen, and in fact white is losing in a kind of forced way, so he can't get out. Already this is a completely lost position. A very beautiful finale happens when white takes the queen. I'm just going to show you this a bit later, but let me explain what happens after h takes g3. If white takes the pawn instead, now remaining with the threat on the queen and the rook on h8, after h takes g3, black can simply go with queen e7, and in fact after knight takes h8 there is the simple queen h7 coming, followed by knight g4 and threatening checkmates like queen h2. Black's attack on the king side is simply decisive. For this reason, it's not a good idea for white to take the pawn. He has to get his chance and take the queen, as white exactly did. So there is knight takes d8. And what about black's pieces? If he goes with g takes h2, it seems that white will simply continue with king to h1, and this king is very safe there. There is no concrete idea how black can checkmate. If he plays maybe g takes f2 check, White can even go with something like king to h1, and again we see knight g4. Some checkmating threats will be met by h3. There is nothing else that can happen. White's defense seems to be very solid, and black's pieces don't really seem to be so many to attack against white's king. So what should happen in this position? That was a question that also some chess masters, not really intermediate players, some chess masters asked me when they saw that position for the first time. So they asked me, what is going on here? Why did black really go on that side of variation? So here I can say that in fact it's not about the threats so much as it's about the initiative. Remember that when attacking, it's very important to follow initiative. Initiative presents the possibility to include more pieces with threats against the opponent's position. So right now, moves like g takes h, g takes f, knight g4, they wouldn't really be so effective because they will not bring any other new forces to our attack. In fact, the strongest variation for black is to play bishop g4, attack white's queen, and next move basically to employ some other pieces. So the important thing when we are actually making initiative is always and only to try and add new forces to the attack. In fact, now after the move queen g4, after the move bishop to g4, if white say doesn't really want to give up the queen and play something like queen to e1, black can continue with knight d4, particularly strong, and the plan is next move to go with knight e2 check. So if white tries to protect it with knight to c3, there is a very beautiful and really nice checkmate that can arise. Black can play knight f3 check, g takes f3, and there is a very beautiful bishop takes f3 coming. The bishop from c5, as you can see now, is pinning the pawn on f2 to white's king on g1, and in the same time, if he takes on g3 with his own pawn, then there is the simple but very beautiful rook h1 check. White's king has no any squares to go. If white doesn't take on g3, then next move black's threat is connected with g takes h2, and white's king will have no squares to go. As you can see, also the queen from e1 blocks the way for white's rook to go on with an e1, and that's really horrible. So it's all in black's favor after the variation of knight d4. And well, what about some other moves? Like, say, what about if white tries queen to c1? Well, in this case, black can still play knight d4, and additionally, we have the threat of knight e2 check, and the queen will be hanging. That's very important because after, say, knight to c3, knight f3 check, f takes g takes f, and bishop takes f3. Even if white tries to go something like rook to e1, g takes h, king to f1, and h1 with a rook even, will actually force a checkmate to white's king. Very nice and still precise way to finish the game. So basically, in our example, white didn't really force the events with queen c1 or queen e1 just to try and see what black has in mind. He understood that the situation is already difficult since knight d4 is coming, and he tried to play knight f7. Now, it seems that there is a tricky idea. If black takes the queen, white can simply go with something like even knight takes h8, and he will still get some kind of material advantage. Like he has 3 pieces to 4. Right now he has rook for a bishop, and that's a kind of material advantage. I don't say that white's position is very beautiful here, but still, at least he will really force black to lose his attacking opportunities. That's why after knight f7, black didn't take the queen. He played rook takes h2, which is really very strong. Now his plan is not simply to care about the queen, but to continue with the deadly attack against white's king, and to focus upon how to add the more pieces with tempos against white. So after rook takes h2, white played in this position queen d2, trying to save the queen, and then there it comes the very strong knight d4, threatening knight e2 and both knight f3 check. In fact, after seeing the threat of knight a2, white decided to protect it with knight c3, but here black played the very strong knight to f3. The two threats cannot be prevented in one time. G takes f, bishop takes f3, and in this position white decided that the only move to continue with is queen h6 to offer back the queen, but maybe now again after rook takes h6 and knight takes h6 he will remain with the rook for a bishop, so a kind of advantage. There are still some halves. However, black played in this position the move rook to g2 check, a very beautiful way to finish the game that only shows how magnificent black's all pieces are already set. So rook g2 check, king to h1, and there it comes, rook takes f2. Very beautiful. So the point is that if white goes with something like king g1 right here, with this kind of variation of black to check and then go back, with this kind of windmill that he's employing, he forces white to lose the game, since after rook g2 check now, king to h1, black has the beautiful but really strong rook to g1, a double discovered check that white cannot really prevent. So the h2 square is being taken by the pawn, the bishop and the rook are giving checks to white's king, and in the same time we see how black's bishop on c5 is supporting the rook on g1. A really magnificent and very instructive example to show how really important is to include most of our pieces on a attack against the opponent's king. And summing up from these two examples, here are some of the most important advice that I want to give you when employing attack against an opponent's castled king. On the first place, always look at the opportunities for you to move more pieces in front of the opponent's castled king. So that's very important, because if you get 4 or more pieces in front of the opponent's king, even if it seems that there is nothing in particular, there will still be some threats. So maybe not now, but maybe on some further moment, you can exploit these pieces and try to put them on action, like they will create some direct attacks against the opponent's king. Or maybe in other ways, those pieces can already be set, so if you begin some attack over there, they will already be prepared. That's what we call a prepared attack against the opponent. So always when his king is castled, try to include more pieces. The second thing, like a tip that I want to give you, is that it's very important always to care about the opponent's defense. Like if you notice that for example, he wants to transfer a piece for the defense, you can maybe try to prevent it, like try and eventually put some problem in order to make him forget about this plan, or maybe say try to exchange that piece which he can employ on defense. That way he will remain with this awkward defense on his king, and basically this will keep your chances of successful attack against his king. So that's just the second. And the third and most important is always to look at the concrete and very active continuations. Remember that with passive moves, with backward moves, you cannot employ a successful attack. Always take care to play the most active and concrete moves, forcing moves, as we call them, that will practically force your opponent to defend or maybe play awkward. That way you will keep your initiative, you will keep your active opportunities, and you won't let your opponent really protect his position, so protect from the threats, and then maybe improve his position somehow in order to really avoid further combinations. So these are actually the most important things about how to do attack against castled king. Care about those things, and very frequently you will see how the opponent's castled king doesn't really seem to be so protected as it has to be. So by organized attack and of course appropriate moves, you can create really dangerous threats against the opponent's king and basically a successful attack. So thank you, and see you next time.